We've traveled back in time.
Let's talk about the mystery of the Druids.
Uh-oh, here comes company.
They look like soldiers.
Don't panic. Let's find out what they want.
Hello, it is your boy CreamyC with an extra long video for an extra special game. I was going to do a video on the rebuild of Reach, but I figured 22 minutes and 36 seconds of me bitching about the DMR and how it turned all my favorite big team battle maps into donuts wouldn't make the most entertaining video. So I figured I'd do another game that all the cool kids played back in the day as well. The Mystery of the Druids. What a well-designed masterpiece. Okay, I can't even finish that sentence with a straight face. I'm going to make one thing abundantly clear. If you ever get the idea in your head that you should play this game, I have one simple word of advice for you. Don't. This game is ass, in aspic, because this is a game about performing the simplest of tasks in the most convoluted, tedious, and morally bankrupt ways imaginable. Our story begins when we launch the game. Here, the player is informed that there is indeed a mystery regarding druids. Of course, these are not the druids, these are just rocks and trees. These are the druids. They're in Stonehenge, performing a ritual over an infant. They're also making this guttural sound that sounds like a backed up toilet. As druids performing rituals involving porno grind vocals are wont to do, most of them spontaneously combust. Fast forward to the present day, and we're thrown into the loafers of Detective Brent Halligan as he's being chewed out by the chief of police, whose hair is an absolute crime against humanity in this gorgeously rendered CGI cutscene. Not that Halligan's hair is any better. The man looks like he commissioned a life-sized version of one of those hair pieces for Lego figurines and is just wearing it around expecting people not to notice. To be honest, nearly all of the character models are absolutely horrifying in this game. The raving elderly lunatic on the front of the box was just the tip of the iceberg. After this cutscene, we're introduced to this game's stunning in-game graphics and dialogue system. The lack of proper anti-aliasing really makes the character models pop. They look like the hastily photoshopped Wojaks in my video thumbnails. The lack of resolution upscaling certainly doesn't help either. To be fair, the static backgrounds generally look fine, but good lord these character models are an eyesore. To start, we immediately have to deal with one of the most cumbersome dialogue systems I've seen in a video game. Basically, you ask a question and follow that one question all the way through without deviating from that specific subject. When all the dialogue is exhausted from that line of questioning, you have to exit out of the dialogue and sit through all of it again in order to ask a different question. You can hit escape to skip lines, but be careful because you can accidentally select something you didn't mean to select. Sometimes there are multiple questions that branch off of those questions as well. This turns a simple 5-minute dialogue into an overly convoluted 15-minute conversation with too much repetition. It's a real titty twister. In this part of the game, Halligan is assigned to investigate a case involving a series of murders involving the skeletons of humans being completely stripped from flesh, aptly titled The Skeleton Murders. The case was thought to have been closed after Halligan's fellow detective Lowry put an innocent man in prison, but Lowry faces no consequences from this action. His only punishment is that he was taken off the case. Actually, scratch that. I'm pretty sure being forced to sit in this position was also part of the punishment. Either that, or his mere existence is such a flex on Halligan that his body just naturally levitates midair.
You know what I think, Halligan? I think I don't need to tolerate a detective in a 20-pound suit walking past my door criticizing the quality of my work.
After an excruciating run through the dialogue tree, Halligan is then given a file that he never reads because reading about the background of a case is lame, and is told to go check out the skeleton they found in the park to get to the bottom of the murders. This is about as good a time as any to express my hatred for this character. Brent Halligan is an extremely dismal man. The manual describes him as a loser who is written off by members of the female sex, and I can't blame them. He ruins so many innocent people's days throughout the course of this game for no reason other than to see the world burn. This guy is so awful that if he were a real person in the current year, he'd be one of those grown-ass men who unironically says yikes or y'all, despite not being from the South. The first display of Halligan's antics is the fact that when you interact with the scanner, he scans his own face. I can't tell if it's this game's general jank, or if he's actually making a funny face in this picture, but this act really rubs me the wrong way. I figured this point in the game would be a good time to save, so I did. This save system is so low effort. It just opens the file explorer and has you manually enter the save. Like the rest of the game, this isn't really that annoying, but it caught me off guard the first time because this game's color scheme is mostly greens and browns, so the sudden outburst of bright white light fried my retinas. Brent then goes to the crime scene after being chewed out, but not before picking up some matches from the chief's desk, a roll of evidence bags, a green scarf, and some other seemingly useless bullshit. He also goes to Lowry's office and asks him if he's seen his wallet.
Just a quick question, Lowry. Have you seen my wallet?
Your wallet? You've got a nerve. I haven't really had a very pleasant day so far, as you might have noticed. Why would I worry about your bloody wallet?
He also wanted to borrow Lowry's scissors for some reason. Of course, Lowry says no because Halligan is a depressing piece of shit who never returns things, but I decided to roleplay as Halligan a bit and turn on this prick's fan. Yeah, that'll show him. He'll have to get up from that power pose and go all the way across the room and have to turn it off if he gets a little too cold or his papers start getting blown all over the place. Halligan finally arrives at the crime scene and talks this cop's ear off. Most of what they say to each other is trivial bullshit, but Halligan asks him if he's seen his wallet and begs him to help him look for it. I have no idea why this is a dialogue option. You have access to the crime scene already, so it's not like you need to distract the cop. It wouldn't be too big a deal if it weren't for this painful dialogue system. The cop also mentions that the person who discovered this body was a jogger, but he says the jogger was in shock upon finding the bloodied bones and had to be taken to the hospital. Since Halligan is a modern-day Sherlock Holmes, he obviously doesn't follow this lead to get any more information. That would just be silly. Halligan inspects the corpse and observes that this person is indeed no longer amongst the living, so he takes a femur and a clump of burnt grass and returns to the science lab at the police station. Halligan shows the forensic scientist, Chris, the bone that he didn't even properly wrap, and the scientist is revealed to be about as useless as Halligan. He does, however, know of a scientist who isn't a complete waste of space, an anthropologist by the name of Dr. Turner. Halligan immediately heads over to the museum, only to discover that it's locked. This is the first in a series of comically convoluted puzzles that you have to solve in order to complete the game. How are we going to open this door? Find a key under the mat, throw a rock through the window and climb in, knock on the door to see if anyone is inside? No, that would make way too much sense. Here's what we have to do in order to get into the museum and talk to the doctor. I'm sure you'll find it quite intuitive. First, we approach the payphone to see if we can call who's inside the museum. Remember, this game is almost as old as I am, which means not everyone was walking around with a cell phone back then. So this scene makes sense in the context of the time this game was made. Of course, Halligan doesn't have 50 cents to pay for the phone. Or, this game is set in England, so I guess it's 50 pence. Take a guess on how Brent will get this money. If your answer does not involve robbing a nearby homeless person, you'd be incorrect. He goes to the homeless person and discovers that he enjoys an alcoholic apple cider, commonly known as Applejack, not to be confused with the breakfast cereal. Halligan realizes he needs the coins in the man's bag, so he tries to steal them. Obviously, he has denied the coins he needs to make the call, so he goes back to the laboratory and wipes down the flasks that contain alcohol. He bets Chris that he could drink the alcohol in the flasks, so Chris gives him a full cup of ethanol. Halligan chugs the ethanol, then passes out. When he wakes up, he has discovered that Chris has left the room. This is because anyone with any formal training in science knows that the best way to treat someone who has recently passed out from alcohol poisoning is to just leave him alone on the floor passed out on his back. Halligan figures out which bottle was safe to drink from by inspecting which one had Chris's fingerprint on it, which should only be one bottle because, as mentioned before, Halligan had wiped down the bottles before chugging 180 proof ethanol like the 200 IQ problem solver he is. Of course, he can't go around giving laboratory-grade alcohol to people, so he obviously mixes it with some apple cider in a flask. This is where things get real dicey. He gives the alcohol from the laboratory to the homeless guy, not only continuing to enable the man's addiction for a few coins, but also giving him a substance known to cause permanent blindness and even death if enough is taken. Upstanding detective work, Brent. Halligan gives the homeless guy the Applejack, and then the homeless guy passes out after Brent goes off screen for a second. This genius maneuvering gives Halligan access to the vast treasure trove of about £1 in tuppence. Well, I'm pretty sure it's not actually in tuppence, I just wanted to say tuppence. He takes his newfound wealth to the phone booth and gives Dr. Turner a call. He doesn't answer, it's actually a woman who answers the phone. He asks if she's a secretary. She's offended by this because that's actually a pretty scummy thing to assume, and she hangs up. Halligan returns to Chris, who informs him that she's actually Dr. Turner's daughter Melanie, who is also an anthropologist, and Halligan returns to the phone booth to call Melanie again. She lets him in, and he asks her about the skeleton murders, and sees if she has any insight that could help him get one step closer to solving the case. She takes the bone, and we're now playing as Melanie. This is a really weird transition, because I was just sitting there for a few minutes, as I thought this part was just Brent waiting for the bone to be processed through the, bone machine. Okay, bone machine sounded a lot less sexual in my head. Now, you actually have to examine this femur as Melanie. I'm not going to go through all the minutiae of how she did it, because that's not exactly comedy gold. I will mention, however, that she does find gold in the notches of the bone, which match up with the slashing pattern of an ancient sickle that happens to be on her desk. She is, of course, so shocked by this discovery that she astrally projects across the room to tell Brent about the historian Arthur Blake, who can tell Halligan more about the Druid order and their rituals and how they relate to the skeleton murders. Halligan goes to Dr. Blake's rundown shack that looks way nicer on the inside, and talks to Arthur about the ancient Druid rituals and how they are going to enslave humanity through magic and attain immortality and all that boring shit. But they need an amulet that's located somewhere in France. This is where the music is at its most disruptive. I had to lower the bass music volume because the piano mashing overpowered the sounds of the dialogue, and I didn't have subtitles on just yet.
The skeleton murders. You may have read about them in the papers.
Oh, yes. Of course.
Mr. Blake, I believe there may be some sort of ritual behind these murders.
Halligan makes his trip to France and speaks to a silent sailor and a grumpy but helpful fisherman by the name of Pierre. Pierre is clearly a Frenchman who was raised in France, but speaks in an English accent.
Castle? Oh, you mean the burnt down mound of rubble on the outskirts of the village, I suppose?
His pride and joy is his fishing pole, and he absolutely despises the captain of the ship's cat because she regularly knocks over his bait. He also informs Halligan that the ship's captain would like to be referred to by his full title, Le Capitaine des Neuves. I shortened it so I had less of an opportunity to butcher it. After Halligan addresses the captain by his full name, he tells him a long list of stories that are actually quite interesting, such as the time he was stranded on Nantucket Island. He's actually a solid and somewhat nuanced character, despite his French accent eventually transitioning into a Caribbean-sounding accent, of course.
Pierre? Ah, yes, old Pierre. I expect he has been telling you about his pike, the one that was 5 meters long.
Yes, he did.
This is another thing I don't get about this game. There are some fairly decent voice actors, but then there are voice actors whose respective characters sound like they're aware that they're in an adventure game. Melanie, for example, sounds like Dora the Explorer when she's pointing things out.
A medieval book of recipes. Let's see what it says.
The captain also informs Halligan that the noble who had the amulet is buried in a structure that can be easily destroyed by salt, which is part of some ancient druid curse. That's a recurring theme of this game, ancient druid magic. How did these murders get committed and covered up so easily? Ancient druid magic. Why is Halligan's life so awful? Ancient druid magic. I wish I had something that ridiculous I could blame all my problems on so I could feel better about myself. Now, you may be asking, how does Halligan get this salt? That's a good question. This one is actually a little more reasonable, if you don't consider going to the nearest CVS and buying salt an option. There's some salt buildup on the waterline of the boat. Halligan retrieves that salt by putting the captain's cat in a bag, releasing her near Pierre's bait bucket, telling Pierre he'll watch over his fishing rod when he's out to buy bait, tying the bucket to the fishing rod, and scraping up the salt from the side of the boat. He doesn't return the fishing rod either, even though Pierre himself said it was extremely expensive and he really cared about it. That seriously kind of stung, because Halligan did not need that fishing pole anymore. Halligan's warpath continues through the castle, where his turtle-like slowness just starts to become apparent, and he discovers that he's being spied on. He finds the mausoleum in which the Lord's corpse is held, and crushes up the salt by using a piece of evidence on top of someone's tombstone so it can blow in the wind and destroy this 1,000-year-old sandcastle. He opens the chest and finds the amulet, which is still in good shape after all these years. On his way home, Halligan decides to hide the amulet while he goes out and gets some air. First, he stows it in the most obvious place to look, the grate for the air vent. I don't understand why he can't just take it with him and store it between his ass cheeks or something. I guess that wouldn't provide conflict, because there is barely any conflict in this pulse-pounding story at this point, or at least none that Halligan didn't simply manufacture through his own incompetence. Halligan returns to Blake, and Melanie is materializing on top of him for some reason. It's worth noting that she's not supposed to have yet met up with Blake at this point in the story, it's just a bug. In fact, what's hilarious is, Halligan tells Blake to contact Melanie Turner at the end of this dialogue. It's like, she's right there. After visiting Blake, Halligan returns to the police station and is chewed out by the chief. Halligan, of course, needs to make a database inquiry, so we have to wade through this bureaucratic nightmare. This section is unpleasant because, as a college student, this hits a little too close to home. For some reason, the chief is angry because we poisoned a homeless guy, and he wants us to investigate the old-fashioned way without being able to make a database inquiry. Of course, Halligan forges the chief's signature by putting some carbon paper on top of the database paper and under the stationary requisition form, so he is able to make this inquiry. That means we can add forgery on top of destroying evidence and deliberate poisoning to the list of charges that Halligan has racked up. At this point, I'd also like to add that there's no way to pause the game. Usually it's not a big deal because Brent will be right where you left him, but sometimes Montezuma seeks his revenge a few minutes after your morning coffee, and you're in the middle of an important cutscene and haven't saved in a while. All I'll have to say is, it's a good thing I got a new pack of undergarments this Christmas. After that little maneuver, Halligan decides to head over to the Druid Lord Sinclair's manor because he suspects that he's the one behind this recent string of murders. Of course, simply walking up to the front door and knocking does not work, so we have to add property damage and breaking and entering to the list. Halligan steals some shears from the gardener by setting a bush on fire. I imagine this gardener is not doing his job properly because that bush really should not have caught on fire after one match was thrown in. What's even weirder is it's still green. We snap through the electric fence with the shears and the scissors and head on over to the house. Halligan's genius strategy here is to get captured within seconds of breaking in. But Lord Sinclair seems perfectly okay with this and just sends him upstairs to think about what he's done. Halligan manages to break out of the guest room with this painting of a druid holding a severed leg that just screams innocent by doing this classic, overly complicated puzzle in order to get the key that was conveniently left in the keyhole, and then he goes downstairs to witness another skeleton murder taking place. This time, the skeleton is still alive and still has a lot of flesh on him. Obviously, getting all of your flesh stripped off from the bottom to top is a little painful, so he is screaming in agony. Except, I don't think I'd be screaming on a loop like this guy is, if I were in his position. Come on, dude. Just because these guys are mutilating your body does not mean you get to mutilate my eardrums. Halligan is then invited to the dinner, and invited into their inner circle, where we discover that 5 druids are trying to roll the world through a ritual involving the amulet. I don't know why these guys thought Halligan was inner circle material. This is the same guy that has a running tab at the local pizza parlor. I also find it weird that Halligan is just scarfing down this human flesh like he hasn't eaten in months. Maybe I was right in my Rise Son of Rome review. Maybe human flesh tastes like South Carolina barbecue. Sadly, I don't have the resources to put that theory to the test. Luckily, Melanie comes to the rescue and sneaks through the hole that Halligan left. Melanie gets captured just like Brent and is taken to the same room. Ah, there's Brent. I wonder how they're gonna get out of this one. He clearly seems to have been brainwashed. I'm not worried though. I trust we'll get out of this one. Adventure games like to— oh, never mind. Okay, this is one of the only parts in the game where you can die. You're actually supposed to pick up the rocks as Melanie and throw them at discount Jean-Claude Van Damme and his pal to distract them, so she can break in. Once we've broken in, we're able to solve this strangely unsecure combination lock and grab the amulet. A brainwashed Halligan comes in and starts a slap fight with Melanie. But a good strike to the noggin clears things up right away. They teleport out of the mansion, then teleport to Blake's house. You can tell they really cut corners on this specific part of the game. I mean, they cut corners with this entire game, but it's especially apparent in this part. There's not even like a transition between scenes. After a long and boring cutscene that bludgeons you with the plot about druidic rituals to take over the world and time travel or whatever, Halligan goes to borrow a book from the library for Blake. Of course, this is Oxford Library, so Halligan has to use the computer to find anything because this is a very large building. Unfortunately, a professor is using the only computer in that entire library that's capable of finding the book. So Halligan sneaks a book into his pocket and triggers his car alarm in order to frame him for stealing the book. It doesn't make sense either, because Halligan tried to steal the book before, but the lady just let him off with a warning. The professor tries to steal one book in his 20 years there, and it's put on his record, and he's required to fill out a form. It doesn't make any sense to me. Anyway, Halligan finds the book. It's unable to leave the library, so he switches the cover and checks it out that way. Blake finds out that Halligan and Melanie need to go to 12 Bridges in order to figure out something about time travel so they can stop the original ritual from occurring. Before he can provide any further information, a fireball falls from the sky and kills Blake, who couldn't get out of the house in time. After hitting what seems to be a dead end, Halligan and Melanie go to 12 bridges and trigger a time travel sequence to start the final chapter of the story. If it sounds like I'm skipping sections, I'm really not. This game is just that poorly paced. These guys somehow made a game that involved flaying people alive, cannibalism, mysteries involving religions thought to be long lost, and ancient rituals, one of the most boring gameplay experiences of all time. Brent and Melanie go through the portal in 12 bridges and travel back in time to the 11th century. Not even 5 seconds after they leave the portal, they get captured by soldiers who think they're Danish spies, and Melanie is locked up in the kitchen for some reason, and not the dungeon. Honestly, I don't even know anymore with this game. I'm not even going to bother trying to explain this one. She talks to the guards, who have some pretty hilarious dialogue.
Do you want her to escape? What a fool you are!
Don't call me a fool!
Then don't be a fool! Then I won't call you one!
And then she makes some knockout tea to, knock him out. This is one of the most tedious sections of the game, because you have to weigh out every measure of the leaf, and if you make a mistake, you have to dump the water out all over again. Melanie ends up freeing Brent and escaping, but they're captured again, and Brent lands in a monastery. This conveniently pipelines them both straight to the place where the main villain Surston lives. Surston is so evil that he maniacally explains his plans to Halligan while he's peacefully working at his desk.
I will grind you underfoot, if it pleases me to do so. That is all you may expect from me. Now get out of my sight.
Brent is tasked to stop him by Maglor, who's a so-called good druid, who looks suspiciously like Arthur Blake, who was killed by a sky laser earlier. Maglor explains that the druids are going to infuse 5 babies with the powers to potentially rule the world and gain immortality. And it is revealed that these 5 babies grew up to be the men who were kind enough to share some down-home barbecue with Halligan after he broke into the mansion. Brent is given free rein to go anywhere in the monastery, as is Melanie, who chooses to spend the entire time reading books. Brent, however, chooses to spend his time more wisely by clearing out a bird's nest from a chimney so he can break into a door that leads to a crystal ball which tells them when and where the ritual is going to take place. I'm not going to explain the context to any of that, because it's much more hilarious if I don't. It's at this point that Brent begins to resign himself to the fact that this story is absolutely insane. We don't see how that thread turns out, though, because we never see Halligan running into the police station like an Olympic champion after this point. When Brent opens the door to the crystal ball with the key, we're greeted with one of the worst mazes in video game history. There's no rhyme nor reason to it, just keep going until you get to the bottom. It's like this game is either trying to waste your time or really wants to keep you from seeing the rest of it. If it's the latter, why wait until this point to put a barrier to progress like this in the game? It's not like the rest of this game is any worse than what came before it.
Wow. Wow.
Brent gets to the end of the maze and finds the crystal ball that will tell him the exact logistics of the ritual. He has to go back up to the monastery to figure out how to use the thing, but luckily progress through the maze is saved, so you don't have to do it more than once. One time is still too many though. Brent tells Maglor about his discoveries, but Surston is about to put an end to their skulking. Luckily, Brent and Maglor are about to escape by parachuting out the window with a bedsheet. Unfortunately, it is the law in this game that every old man with a white beard has to experience death via fireball, so Surston Hadoukens Maglor out of the sky with the wrath of 1,000 gods. Well, I wouldn't say 1,000 gods, more like one slightly annoyed demigod, because after Halligan lands, he finds Maglor again, and it takes him a minute to die after he asks for mistletoe to heal his wounds. Brent finds the mistletoe, but refuses to administer it for reasons I'll get into later. Halligan realizes that he had conveniently landed right next to the temple that held the rod needed to complete the ritual, so he goes and solves this tedious puzzle that honestly is not that interesting to talk about. You're just taking stuff and dumping it into other stuff and maybe lighting it on fire. For the final puzzle, Halligan must place tiles in the correct position. It's really boring because you have to walk down this long-ass staircase and pick up the 8 plates on the way down. Since this is the final puzzle, it obviously ends with the epic final confrontation between Halligan and Surston.
What are you doing?
Melanie!
Brent! He's going to kill me!
Let her go.
Oh, yeah, this confrontation is not that epic. Surston has Melanie hostage, demands that Halligan give him the rod back, and Halligan gives him the rod on the condition that Surston swear on his honor that no harm will come to either of them. He gives Surston the rod, they teleport to their own era just in time for their new ritual to start with Lord Sinclair, and Halligan realizes that nothing really came of their travels to the past. But wait! In a last-ditch effort to save the world, Halligan pulls out the broken garden shears he got in Sinclair's mansion, and takes the ultimate sacrifice by shanking Melanie in the stomach with them. Since this technically broke Surston's vow, Surston's honor was tarnished and all the Neo-Druids fade from existence because it means that the ritual was never performed in the past. If this ending sounds like a convoluted and rushed mess, that's because it is. Luckily, Halligan is able to save Melanie with the mistletoe, and we now discover why he never gave Maglor the mistletoe to save his life. Brent is just not that kind of guy. Of course, the story of the Neo-Druids is over, but the ending leaves a lot of lingering questions. Did the people who were murdered get brought back to life, or are they still murdered? Does Melanie readily forgive Brent for stabbing her in the torso and help him get his life back on track? Does Pierre ever get his fishing pole back? These are questions that are left unanswered because the game just straight up restarts after the credits. Obviously, this is for the best because the first thing anyone thinks when finishing this well-paced and well-written masterpiece is, how soon can I play this again? Before we go, I have some thoughts on this game. I never really felt frustrated or angry at the game. It was more boring and mildly amusing at times. The gameplay itself isn't an issue here. It's just a point-and-click adventure. There are lots of games that many would consider some of the best experiences they've had with a video game that uses this exact formula of pointing and clicking. It's the terrible plot, boring pacing, and counterintuitive puzzles that are next to impossible to solve without a guide. And yes, I'm aware that this game is almost as old as I am, but this game still looks like ass even for the year 2000. At the time this game came out, we had games such as Alice, Dark Cloud, Diablo 2, and Final Fantasy IX. Alright, that concludes my overly long video on Mystery of the Druids. I hope it was worth the wait. More videos to come. Thanks for watching. Creamy out.